I'm Jonathan, a technical writer with OutSystems based in Lisbon. And aside from the writing, I've also recently been working on the tooling side of technical writing. And part of that work is the subject of the talk today on using AI and LLMs in Docker's code pipelines. So hopefully many of you are already practicing or familiar with the benefits of the Docker's code approach to technical content. And the team I work with at OutSystems, the technical knowledge team, is responsible for public documentation and training content for OutSystems products. We use a Docker's code approach to produce and maintain the content. And in practice, that means we use the tooling that's on the slide and custom tooling we've built on top of that. Why LLM? We started as a team by experimenting with prompting models in the OpenAI playground, building prompts and finding out what could work to help us in our daily practice. We were particularly interested in use cases that could be applied to both improving existing content through batch updates and used on an ongoing basis. The use cases that had good results fit into two broad categories: automating routine writing tasks and providing suggestions for bringing content into compliance with the OutSystems style guide. There was then a prioritization of the use cases based on what would benefit the end users of the content the most. I'm going to dive into one of those prioritized use cases now before then zooming out and talking more about the general approach. So use case number one, add missing alt text. So alt text or alternative text is a concise description of an image, primarily used by screen readers for visually impaired users and by search engines for indexing images. Related is the title attribute, which provides additional information about the image, typically displayed as a tooltip when the mouse hovers over it. Okay, let's go a bit meta here. And so essentially in this slide for this image, if I had the screen reader active, this alt diagram of the system architecture of the alt text microservice showing its integration with GitHub and VS Code clients is the alt text. The title is alt text architecture diagram. This use case fits into that first broad category of routine writing tasks. Having alt text for images is in the OutSystems style guide. It was prioritized as a use case primarily because a lot of the legacy content before the formal style guide was missing them. So it would benefit from a batch remediation with human validation. Descriptive alt text for images on public websites is required as part of the EU Accessibility Act 2025. At this point, I just want to thank Bernardo Capinha, my team's graphic designer, who proposed the idea behind this use case and worked on the prompt engineering and validation. But now for the fun stuff, the technical detail. So the approach to taking the experiment forward was to build a microservice on top of the LangChain framework, which I saw from people's contributions at the beginning that a few of you have used, and that's great. And essentially, I think of this as a way of abstracting away a lot of the complexity of working with LLM. And this microservice that we built essentially serves two clients, a GitHub action and a Visual Studio Code extension. So if we look at the request schema of the service accepts both text and images. And the information in the schema is then processed and structured in the prompt to the LLM. The LLM used in this use case is multimodal, accepting both text and images as input. It's worth noting that this is a recent development in LLM, but a key enabler for this use case. Currently, the only LLM that's been tested with this service is OpenAI's GPT-4 Vision Model Preview. Looking at the response schema, it's essentially identical to what the LLM returns post-validation. The fact that LLMs can reliably return structured data to a schema specification is another recent development and another key enabler. This use case, and actually all the others we've worked on, essentially requires. This is one example where LangChain shines. For those of you familiar with Python, you can easily use a pedantic object to define the schema of the LLM response structure. So let's jump into a demo to see how this works in practice with the GitHub Action client here. So yeah, here's a pull request I made earlier. So let's say that, we want to open a pull request with 5 new documents, and all of the documents have images, but 4 are missing complete alt text and title attributes for those images. So this is essentially the commit of the 5 files. What happens now is essentially this client asynchronously moves through each supported file in the pull request. And first it identifies that it's a supported type, but then it basically pulls out all of the local images and the image URLs and the text. And for each file that doesn't have complete alt text and titles, it will send that request to the service endpoint. And then it will essentially send back in accordance with the response schema. And the client will then essentially parse this and format it. Well, first of all, it will do the commit. So for example, here, we see that this is a Jupyter notepad with markdown definition. So before it didn't have a complete alt text and title, but now it's essentially added an alt text and a title. It's also added a review comment because I think human validation is important. So it's asking for review here on the file. And it's essentially done this for all of the files which didn't have complete alt text and titles. So if you want to write the alt text and title yourself for the images, that's great. If you want to use the Visual Studio Code plugin, which calls this endpoint to do it as well, that's great. This action won't trigger essentially for that file. I just wanted to note here also that this is kind of like an optional environment variable for the service that we can add, which is a service called Langsmith, which is a cloud service from LangChain, who produced this framework. And this is very powerful because it essentially gives you an understanding of what was prompted to the model and what came back from the model. So all of the text, all of the images that were prompted to the model across the prompt, and what the output was, essentially what the response was. Okay, so back to the slide. So in terms of like the general approach of taking experiments to production, kind of what wasn't on the menu for us was building like an all-encompassing product covering all technical writing use cases that had good results in the team's experiment. Because first and foremost, we were resource constrained. There was great collaboration from the team during the experiment and the strategy work, but for the dev work itself, it was just me partially allocated alongside the technical writing work. So instead, the approach was, and still is, to build independent microservices, essentially, for the prioritized use cases. And then an iterative approach to working on these microservices and improving the client. I just wanted to say that this vector database in the diagram, an important note, this wasn't used in either of the use cases in this presentation. It's essentially a searchable repository of chunks of our content that can be then injected into the prompt of the LLM. We use this for an internal Slack chatbot that answers technical questions about our product, and for another editorial use case that's in production, but I won't have time to talk about here, so do ask in the Q&A if you're interested. So the second use case is fixing the passive voice. So I think writing consistently in the active voice is hard, particularly if you don't have technical writing experience. So many writing assistants do a good job at essentially identifying the passive voice, but not such a good job at transforming it to the active voice, which can often require a nuanced understanding of context in the article beyond the sentence. So this use case fits into that second broad use case category that we saw earlier of providing suggestions for bringing content into compliance with the OutSystems style guide. The request schema for this service, it doesn't require the text to be markdown formatted here because there's no special syntax. It's just essentially passing out the sentences. And the approach is that the service links the text with Veil using a style definition of the passive voice. Veil being a popular open source linter that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then it uses that output essentially as an input to the LLM, which is tasked with transforming the passive sentences to active sentences in the context of the full text. So we opted here to have kind of precise control over the definition of the passive voice rather than leaning on the LLM. So if we now kind of take a look at the response schema, it's what you'd expect. The passive sentences and their revised active counterpart, but notice this clear explanation. We've requested that the LLM also explain the choice of subject for each active voice transformation. So again, let's jump in to see how this works in practice. So the user experience for the GitHub Action client is a little bit different to the alt texter. The workflow isn't being triggered automatically when there's a commit to the pull request. Instead, it's actually called by this command, okay, for a single document. And it will make suggestions in the pull request, which can easily be reviewed and then committed using the suggestions mode of GitHub pull request review. And this explanation, I think, is really powerful because people contribute to the content who might not, as I said, are trying to get the grips with the active voice, can read this and hopefully that will actually improve their writing in the active voice. So they're kind of learning as they're using this service. So I think that's quite a powerful user experience. There's a few other modes, and feel free to check out the demo and see it in full. I don't have time to go over them quite now. Alexander gave me 20 to 25 minutes, so I'm 22 minutes in, and I'm going to stop generating and hand back to Alexander to lead the group discussion. I just want to take a moment to thank all the technical knowledge team at OutSystems for helping to incubate this work. Without their support, it wouldn't have been possible. And thanks to all of you for listening. Happy to take any questions either here or my contact details are there and a link to the slides. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing for now.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was a great journey into all these great technical details, and things were quite automated. Especially, I think the passive voice rewrite, that was very nice to see. Yeah, we have now some questions here. Some people added them in the chat and I've copied them over. Others are still writing their questions. Let's see if I'm missing some. The others who are still on here, they can help me to prioritize the questions. So you will see some orange bubbles here. And maybe you could want to upvote some of these questions here. So one question I had is, you talked at least about Visual Studio Code and the GitHub Action, and we saw the GitHub Action. What interface was there first? Did you first think of a GitHub Action integration or the Visual Studio Code integration?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think for incubating this work, GitHub Actions are very powerful, okay? Because it essentially allows us to, as a team, the Visual Studio Code plugin is a very private environment, but a GitHub pull request is very collaborative. It allows anybody in the team to see the commit, okay, to discuss the commit. If Langsmith is activated, to even then to modify the prompts themselves and to see how that steers the output. So the GitHub action we see as sort of like a quality gate. So it's making sure that in the case of the alt texter that the documents have alt text. But the Visual Studio Code plugin obviously can be used by principally technical writers on our team, okay, to essentially call the same endpoint. But that isn't going to be used so much by contributors to our content, either kind of outside our team or even outside the company. So I think they're very complementary, actually. But the principal development effort so far has actually gone into the GitHub action. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying you might need both. Well, definitely need a quality gate, and then the Visual Studio Code helps you to do it locally without sharing it first to the public and ensuring that the quality is there. Yeah, that's great.
And I think this is kind of like the principal reason we took this, because in theory you could have put all of the LangChain logic within the GitHub action, right? But we wanted that flexibility to have multiple clients. And I mean, this isn't really on the roadmap, but a lot of our .NET developers use Rider, for example. So in theory, maybe as like one of these research day projects, they could build a Rider plugin, which calls the endpoint if they wanted to make use of it, or even like a Vim plugin. Who knows? Whatever it may be. So that's kind of the principle here, that any client can have access to that kind of common endpoint. Yeah.
And yeah, that's maybe asking a not so technical question next. So the question is, how did the technical writers on your team receive these initiatives?
So, I mean, they were involved from the start, in part, in sort of involved in these experiments. It was kind of quite mixed. So with the case of the alt texter, which is quite an interesting example, what I would say is it really elevated, or whatever kind of it elevated the conversation about alt text. Obviously, it never really was a very pressing topic, if you like, in the team, like the best way to write an alt text, if you like. But suddenly it became a very important topic, and people were reading up on the W3 guidelines and coming up with all sorts of suggestions on, whether alt text should include a full stop, for example, at the end. So essentially, I think this has really kind of driven a very interesting conversation. And actually, with the alt text, for example, we're in the process of kind of collecting some of that feedback and, if you like, kind of iteratively improving the prompt, so they kind of incorporate some of that feedback. So yeah, it's been a very interesting experience to have everybody come together, evolving this work.
And for evolving the work and well, tuning the prompts, I think you had then this Smith view. Was it Smith?
Smith, yeah.
So that you were able to see previous prompts and their responses. You told me that you can change them interactively and try them again and see the different outputs around this.
Yeah, maybe I could share my screen again. So the Langsmith isn't, I believe it's in a private beta now, so it's not available for, I'm not sure what the restrictions on signing up are. And this isn't something actually that we've used in the team, because there has to be a process of getting Langsmith approved. So that's why it's kind of like optional for now. Well, it's optional. But I'm convinced that it's, extremely powerful for doing this kind of like prompt engineering work. So let's, take an example here. I actually included a GIF in this. So what's essentially happening here is that we're bringing up essentially a playground of the prompt, and we're able to change the prompt, provide an OpenAI API key, and then we can essentially see how that changes the output. So the idea here is that somebody could change the prompt in a particular way and then make a comment in the review request. Oh, okay, I changed the prompt in this way, and it really had a positive influence on the on how it steered the model. So that's kind of, I think, really cool, and like where I kind of see the collaboration effort kind of going with LLMs in general. Like, and Langsmith is starting also to give kind of build out tooling so you can version prompts, and you can essentially fork prompts, and take a really kind of like development approach to prompts, like prompts as code. So that's kind of, I think, where things are going in that space.
And Thomas, you raised your hand. You want to join in the discussion?
Yes. My 2 cents in that discussion is everything you do for blind people, you also do for better ranking in search engines, because you can assume that the crawler in the search engine process in processing your data is like a blind person. I think the least search engines take the effort to make their alt text themselves and rate your pictures and things like that. So if you give them the content, they will rate you for the content and rank you, of course, better.
Yeah, so I believe that's right. Search engines do use alt text both in terms of the image search, and also it can affect the page ranking. If it has high quality alt text, I'm told by our SEO expert that this can improve the SEO of the content. So although I'm not an expert, yes, that's one potential benefit of having high quality alt text. I don't think it's the principal one, but it's it is something to consider when you're making the case for entering a project like this. Yeah.
A very different topic was then this OpenAI, all these interfaces to try out things, and running it from the IDE and running it from GitHub Actions. Well, how big is the API bill on API code? Is it like, not sure if you want to say numbers, but is it kind of expected? Is it moderate? How many pizzas you could buy from that money you're paying there?
Yeah, I mean, I think OpenAI have quite a deliberate strategy of making their API very affordable, at least for kind of moderate usage. I mean, the cost, essentially they price it per token, if you like, per 1,000 tokens. But a typical call to the vision model here would be, say 10,000 tokens. So that's going to come out at like, I think, around a penny, a cent or two, essentially. They're quite, it's the cost is, I think, is manageable relative to the benefit here. And this, I mean, obviously there's lots of other language models. It's not just OpenAI. And increasingly these are available as serverless options. And I'm not sure if anyone is interested in using open source models for this kind of use case, but there's, depending on obviously the volume, it might make more sense to use an open source model, but then be prepared to have to fine tune them, and that there's GPU costs for that and so on. So yeah, it's for our use case, OpenAI works really well. So and the cost is, I would say, very reasonable given the benefit that we've had.
Because like the number of calls you're making are probably like a reasonable number of calls per pull request run. So it's not like people interactively doing lots of things and you're not having million users contributing to the docs. So this keeps your API calls down. If you would open it more to the public, then
it's true.
The costs would rise as well.
Yeah, for some projects, you're right. Like that would definitely be a consideration. But remember, once it's added the alt text once, it doesn't need to do it again. So and the client does manage those calls to the service quite well. So
nice. So as you were touching on open source LLMs a bit, so did you try some of those, or maybe some people in the call here want to share their experience with open source LLMs to maybe recognize images or recognizing or rewriting passive voice?
Okay, so I think the obviously the field of open source LLMs is like evolving so rapidly. I think the first thing to say about open source LLMs is there is a step up in technical expertise required to start using open source LLMs. Like when you start using open source LLMs, they're not going to work out of the box for complex use cases like the alt texter, right? So you're going to need to start thinking about fine-tuning, what's called fine-tuning the models. And then you need to start essentially thinking about, okay, I need to get a VM with a GPU. Okay, how am I, like, what inference server am I going to use? Like, there's all of these considerations with using open source LLMs for kind of complex use cases like this, which come into play. Okay, and I mean, again, this is like, kind of extracurricular because I can't really justify that for my day in my day job essentially because this works really well for our use case. So why would we need to kind of use open source LLMs? The cost would be higher and it would be hard to get the quality that OpenAI can provide. But it is interesting for me technically, and I have been making some progress. But getting the multimodal and the structured output to work well in conjunction is like, is kind of at the, should we say, at the cutting edge of where these models are today. So the best open source model. So.
Yeah, and as you also said, like you need to balance your day work or as a technical writer. The question is also here, what would you suggest a solo writer or a smaller team who might not have the skills, time, and people around to build these tools that you built there? One tool that came up was Veil to recognize passive voice in the first place, which might be a start to recognize the voice. But is there anything else you want to add to this, or other tools maybe used before or considered?
I would say, building these types of services with LangChain, there's lots of examples out there. So give it a try. In terms of like out of the box, and to be honest, this is like one of the reasons like we went down this route because there isn't I mean, of course, maybe folks who are familiar with kind of out of the box solutions for these types of sort of integrating AI into Doctor's code, but I didn't find much out there, if you like, that's pre-built that we could use. So, I mean, that's a question for the audience, really. Is anyone else like familiar with projects which are serving these use cases and others in terms of technical writing in kind of using Markdown and kind of a Doctor's code approach?
I give the question to the audience, and maybe you want to raise your hand and just join in. Something I use is Grazi Pro, something that's integrated in IntelliJ. It's at least fixing grammar errors, but I'm not sure if it's fixing so much of the passive voice. I probably need to double check if that works. I haven't seen any integrations in adding alt text for images, so that was really new and interesting to see here. But maybe others can share their experience on both reviewing docs and finding things about passive voice and missing alt text and how to fix them in an automated way.
Anyone? Or it's new for everybody here? Or anybody working on anything similar? I'd also be interested in that.
Romy, you posted something in the chat. Maybe you want to expand on this?
Thank you. So I'm Romeo from OutSystems as well. Hi, Jonathan. See you tomorrow. So we were experimenting with Writer, also another tool that provides this proofreading, checking capabilities. But we were not happy with the API they were offering at that point, so we stick with Veil. Veil offers some really fancy rules for checking language, but also something really simple, like check the next tag after alt as regex. And that's the first iteration we had actually to check the alt text. So the writers would be creating content in Markdown, and they would have like a warning, oh, you need to add something in the alt text. So that's what we tried, but we kept the Veil because the Veil platform, we kind of like the flexibility it offered, and it was free, which was always much easier to pitch to our management than something that needs to be paid for. Thanks.
Yeah, and I agree. Whale has some very good styles named after some internet companies like Google, Microsoft, Red Hat as well have their styles there, and you can pick one if it suits your needs already, which is nice. So we got a new question in the chat. Have you considered to generate alts based on the textual content around the image insertion and point of the docs, and ignoring the image itself?
Okay, this is actually a great question because yes, we have, and actually there was a kind of previous version of this which essentially was that using a single mode of just text, right? And this is essentially what you're asking the language model to do here is guess what the image is, okay? So kind of thinking, okay, based on my training data, like what's going on here? Like, okay, this is probably a screenshot. And this was really helped by the fact that in our style guide, we do say that you should kind of essentially introduce the image, right? So you should say, like, if you're including a screenshot, okay, below is a screenshot of whatever, you should set it up. So it was certainly helped by that. And the language model can essentially infer that context. You don't need to just pass the chunks of text, right? So you can pass in the full article and just ask for structured output. But I mean, it's adding the images themselves on top of that approach, like, is just like an order of magnitude better because, you might just have, what happens if you just have like, if you had a file which just said hello and then had an image, that sort of text-only approach would have no idea like what that image was. But if you have this multimodal approach, obviously it's, it really takes both the text and the image to produce the alt text. And the results, I mean, you can see on the demo, I mean, I think the results with the GPT-4 Vision model are really good. Like, so I'd encourage you to experiment yourself. Yeah.
But the demo was like a dancing, person.
Right.
What's it? Yeah, but then
Yeah.
wouldn't it just say this is a screenshot and this is another screenshot and this is another screenshot? How would it then work with these items? What does it see on the screenshot?
Yeah. So we can jump back. I've recorded this demo. This is essentially, can you hear the audio here or no? I think I might need to do something extra. Okay.
Yeah.
So all right. I'm gonna show in the text then. So for this tagging. So let's look at two images here. So I think because it's Jupyter Notepad, it's not possible to look at a rich version. So I'm going to have to look at the actual images, maybe like side by side here. We'll get there in the end. So I'm going to change. Oh, files change. Yeah. And then we're going to look for these particular images. Okay, so this is one image, right? So this is a diagram, and clearly here it's really understanding the diagram. So diagram illustrating the tagging process with an input text, schema definition, function call to a language model, and the resulting tags. Okay, this is like an example, right, of really understood the image. It's understood it in the context of the text it's in and the image, and it's produced this really nice alt text. And the other image in this document or this notepad with the markdown cells is a screenshot. So screenshot of the LangChain tagging trace interface showing the chat OpenAI component. Okay, component. Maybe we could change that. And the successful extraction of information based on the input and the schema. Okay.
So to summarize, it would work great on diagrams, but maybe a generic screenshot might be difficult. It might say this is a Windows screenshot or a Mac.
Well, no, I think it's really, it's understanding this is a web interface called LangChain, and this is and what it's showing on the screenshot. So
okay, browser screenshot. Yeah, okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm just thinking about the screenshot that I have in mind from my internal documentation at some places.
Yeah, but I think I'd be interested in like what other results people get with this,
Mm.
Yeah, on different types of screenshots and different types of documentation. Yeah.
And the person who asked the question earlier about are there other tools that you could maybe use out of the box? One maybe a bit sad answer to that is I think the off-the-shelf tools will evolve. And what we're seeing here today is maybe a glimpse of the future. And eventually it's going to be on a shelf and going to be able to buy it from a shelf, maybe in a year's time or less. So that's then my look in the future, at least.
I think there's huge potential, right? Because one thing I've seen is like even very prominent open source projects, a lot of them have either no or very poor alt text, right? So, why can't they use tooling like this? Again, it's always with human validation, right? But it's got to be better than having no alt text, right? For accessibility. And yeah, I opened a pull request on LangChain after running this over it and over kind of, I think, about 30 images. And I changed one because I think it needed, it was a little bit, there was a technical inaccuracy there. But other than that, the Harrison on that project basically read them and, merged straight to main. Like he was really happy with them.
So Thomas, you have a question? You raised your hand. Please go ahead.
A comment or two comments. For Drupal, you can use, as far as I've seen, I didn't use them, two modules to generate your alt text and also maybe the title for your picture. So that's available for that content management system. And I also used on my laptop a open source language model. It's called Samantha. You probably don't know it. And it gives me active speech if I ask for it. So this is possible. And my problem with services like OpenAI and so on is imagine you are in a company and you are working on confidential stuff, but also need these services, then you can't post things out of your perimeter. So you need it in-house.
Yeah, there's a really good points. Thanks, Thomas. So I'm curious on the Drupal alt tag generation. Do you know if that's using like a multimodal language model? So that's calling some. Do you know how that's like working behind the hood? Are they?
I don't have
what's
used
the
it.
quality? Yeah.
I just saw the description of the modules and they describe it like it would work.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested in.
Thomas, maybe you could, well, you mentioned Samantha as a model, right? If I understand it correctly, also the Drupal thing. So maybe you could paste the links in the chat so people can have a look afterwards. It would be helpful.
Sure.
And Jonathan, which models did you use or did you try out? Or how long or how many did you try out?
Yeah.
To find these models that you're now working with?
Essentially, we're using GPT-4 for the text only use cases and GPT-4 Vision for the multimodal use cases. The other interesting point of Thomas's question was around confidentiality. Okay, and this is interesting and something we have considered because we're working on content which often is for features which have yet been released. So technically, this is not yet public information. Okay, so actually, the models we're using in production are deployed in Azure OpenAI services. So they're not actually with the OpenAI API. And essentially, the company as a whole has a more like stricter terms with Azure, like a non-disclosure agreement. So they're more happy with that API, if you like, and we have authorization to use it for documentation which is not yet public. And indeed, there's other teams in the company doing very different things, like with stale with other kind of use cases using internal documents which are not public. So that there is the Azure OpenAI services provide sufficient reassurance for the legal people who make these decisions to let us use that model for. I mean, in our use case, obviously, it's like, okay, we're working on documentation that will be public, but okay, it's for features that are not yet public. The documentation isn't public, so strictly according to our AI policy, it's not public information yet. So yeah.
But it sounds like that you as a documentation team were able to jump on an AI train in your company that is already running. So people set up quite a bit of infrastructure already that you hopefully didn't need to do all yourself then.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, there definitely has been a movement towards kind of AI, and I mean, we already have before the whole LLM explosion, an AI team in the product, building AI features for the product. And yeah, we've kind of joined hackathons, which they've hosted, and they've been very supportive of our efforts. So even though it's not kind of strictly, we're not working on product features, we're kind of, but it's, end user documentation as part of the product at the end of the day. So
yeah, then this seems to be a great result of such a hackathon, and that you were able to pull people in that. Sounds like a great company culture, so that you can help from these areas. That's good.
Yeah, it was kind of actually in that the hackathon was where I kind of experimented with fine tuning, if you like, and the more kind of technical deploying open source models and so on. And it was great to have that space to explore those approaches. But yeah, ultimately, I'm doing kind of like if it's the decision between spending time kind of on OpenAI, spending time on fine-tuning open source models, or building a new use case, like with OpenAI models, I'm going to pick the building a new use case because it delivers the most value for our end users. So yeah.
Great getting into that topic as well. So looking at the clock, we might have another 10 minutes of questions. So please pour in your questions. There was the question about how would this work with a governance framework that requires approval streams from stakeholders who are not developers? Well, probably asking for a UI that's not GitHub. Have you thought about that, or are you familiar with any AI-based system in your companies that do it differently?
So how would this approval flow work with in terms of like the alt text need approval, or the code needs approval from? I'm not sure I follow.
I would understand that like the alt text need approval to be changed, right? Or the rewriting from passive to active voice needs approval.
Right. Okay. So I mean that obviously GitHub within repositories has enabled you to essentially define the governance right around pull requests, right, and approvals of pull requests and merging the branches, etc. So I mean that like nobody's merging the main our documentation mains unless they've got approval from one of our team, right? We're responsible for the content, so we're always going to need to approve that any changes to it, whether that's done by AI or a human, or a human and AI in combination, right?
Yeah, and then I believe you have a good knowledge of GitHub and APIs in your technical writer team, and they are familiar with this Roxas code flow in your team, I believe.
That's right. We have some really strong technical expertise in our team. Yeah, it's not uniform across the team, but we definitely have, and everybody knows enough to get the job done. So, but then we have some really technically proficient people who are building, not only AI stuff, but some amazing kind of amazing docs as code tooling around like training content, which hopefully I'm trying to encourage Miguel to do a talk maybe here, like at some point around that.
Yeah, I would love to hear that. Maybe talking about GitHub a bit. So a question I'm personally interested in. So I think the alt text GitHub action was maybe adding additional commits on top of the existing pull request, was it? And the passive voice was doing annotations that I could then accept. Was there maybe a different approach on these two?
Yeah. So there is a different approach. And that is first and foremost because when I was sort of thinking about the user experience there, I feel that kind of alt text is when you're sort of committing a file, that kind of alt text, you should be considering that at the start of the review process, right? Essentially. Mm-hmm. So I really want people to pay attention to that at the start of the review process. With the active voice, and this is actually in production in our internal repos, we actually have a slightly broader service which does more of a style guide review rather than just the passive voice. Essentially, I feel there's more control if you're calling that like with a command. Okay, so it's not kind of an automated thing. It's something which either the contributor can use to improve the content themselves, and typically they would do that in Visual Studio Code, actually, or the reviewer can use in kind of a pull request. But, you know, there's definitely different. I'm not saying that is the right, like the right approach. It's just kind of the way we decided to go, and, you know, it can be, I'm sure it can be improved, and thinking about it, yeah.
It's good to see that there are two different approaches, and maybe you pick one when you're more confident of doing the right thing anyway. Like with alt text, you might be more confident to adding things. And when it's then suggestions about rewriting, you might be more careful and give them more choice. So
that's fair. Yeah, that's fair also.
So I'm now like stopping the recording. So maybe some people want to ask some questions off the record. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for showing us all these examples and answering so many questions we had here. Thanks for being here and choosing this meetup to share this with the world. Yeah, great questions from everybody. And let's continue the conversation. Yeah, happy to talk to you about these use cases, Dox's code generally.